Captain Dae-ho Kim stood at the observation window, sipping his morning coffee. He had seen many damaged ships before, but this one looked like it had been through hell. The docking clamps grabbed the vessel with a loud clang that echoed through the station corridors. Emergency lights flashed as the airlock systems engaged. Inside the Veltara, 43 beings sat in silence. They were the Kithani, and they looked nothing like humans. Their bodies were tall and thin, covered in what should have been beautiful silver scales, but now those scales had turned a dull grey, like old metal left in the rain. Their large eyes, once bright and alert, stared at nothing with exhaustion. Dae-ho watched through the security cameras as station guards entered the ship. The guards wore their usual bored expressions, following standard procedures for processing refugees. They had done this hundreds of times before, with different species from across the galaxy. To them, these were just more mouths to feed and problems to solve. The eldest Kithani, a female named Thessara, struggled to stand as the guards approached. Her movements were slow and painful. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The universal translator on her collar flickered, working hard to convert her words into something the guards could understand. 3 cycles ago, the Kithani's sun had started acting strange. Scientists on their homeworld noticed unusual solar flares and magnetic disturbances. Within weeks, their star began collapsing in on itself, creating a black hole that swallowed everything they had ever known. Planets, moons, space stations, and billions of lives vanished into the darkness. The Veltara had been a cargo ship, not designed for refugees. Its life support systems were never meant to keep 43 beings alive for months of space travel. They had eaten everything they could find, drunk recycled water until the filters broke down, and breathed stale air that grew thinner each day. Now they sat in rows, families holding each other close. Parents tried to comfort children who no longer had the energy to cry. The youngest Kithani had stopped making sounds completely, which worried Thessara more than anything else. In their culture, silent children meant death was near. Station security. Chief Hansu Park entered the ship with his clipboard and scanner. He moved efficiently from one Kithani to another, recording their biological data and health status. The readings were not good. Their life signs were weak, their body temperatures dropping, and their metabolism was shutting down. The Kithani had come to Nexus Station because it was the nearest safe harbor. They had no money, no trade goods, and no skills that anyone wanted. They were simply refugees hoping for mercy from strangers. Thessara clutched a small pouch containing seeds from their homeworld, the last remnants of a civilization that had existed for thousands of years. As the processing continued, other species on the station went about their normal business. Traders haggled over prices, tourists took pictures, and workers maintained the massive facility. Few paid attention to the new arrivals being led to the refugee quarters. After all, desperate beings seeking shelter was nothing new in this part of the galaxy. The Veltara would be scrapped for parts, its usefulness ended. But somewhere deep in the station, these 43 survivors carried the hopes of their entire species. Station Administrator Junwoo Park sat behind his desk, scrolling through housing assignments on his tablet. The morning reports showed another full day ahead, with 3 more refugee ships expected before evening. He rubbed his tired eyes and looked at the available spaces. Most sections were already overcrowded, but Cargo Bay 7 had room. Cargo Bay 7 was where the station stored broken equipment and outdated supplies. The air recycling system worked poorly there, making it stuffy and uncomfortable. The lighting flickered constantly, and strange noises echoed from the old machinery. It was not a place anyone would choose to live, but it was all they had left. Junwoo made the assignment with a few quick taps on his screen. The Kithani would have to make do, just like all the other refugees who had come before them. He had learned not to get emotionally involved in these situations. There were too many desperate beings in the galaxy, and not enough resources to help them all properly. The station's supply officer, Min-ho Cho, arrived at Cargo Bay 7 with a cart full of standard refugee supplies. Protein blocks, water purification, tablets, basic blankets, and medical kits. The same package every refugee received, regardless of their species or special needs. It was efficient and fair, he told himself. The Kaithani gathered around as Minho distributed the supplies. They accepted everything politely, though Thessera looked worried as she examined the protein blocks. These grey, rectangular bars contained all the nutrients that most species needed to survive. They were bland but nutritious, designed to keep anyone alive during difficult times. But something was wrong. Within the first day, several younger Kithani began showing signs of distress. Their breathing became laboured, and their skin started developing dark patches. The protein blocks sat barely touched in their containers. Even the hungriest refugees seemed unable to eat more than a few bites. Thessera knew they were in serious trouble. She approached the cargo bay's communication panel and requested a meeting with station medical staff. Her voice shook as she tried to explain their situation through the universal translator. The device buzzed and clicked, struggling to convert her words into standard galactic common. Dr. Kyung-min Yoon from the medical bay arrived the next morning. He was a Valorian, a species known for their excellent medical skills. His forearms moved quickly as he scanned the Kithani with various instruments. The readings confused him. Their digestive systems were shutting down, but he could not understand why. Thessera desperately tried to explain that her people needed specific types of food. She used complex scientific terms about enzyme chains, biochemical processes, and metabolic requirements. The translator worked overtime, producing strange phrases that made little sense to Dr. Yoon. Words like fermented substrate catalysts and symbiotic bacterial cultures came out as meaningless technical jargon. The doctor prescribed standard digestive aids and left, promising to check on them again in a few days. But the Kithani continued to weaken. Their movements became slower, their voices quieter. The youngest one stopped playing entirely, sitting motionless against the cargo bay walls. Other refugee species in nearby sections began to whisper among themselves. Some said the Kithani were cursed, others claimed they were simply too weak to survive in civilized space. A few suggested that the station would be better off without them, that resources were being wasted on a dying species. Station maintenance worker Jin Seok Lee often passed through Cargo Bay 7 during his rounds. He noticed how the Kithani had arranged their sleeping areas in perfect circles, with the eldest in the center and the youngest on the outside. Even in their suffering, they maintained their cultural traditions and cared for each other with quiet dignity. By the 5th day, 3 Kaithani had collapsed completely. Their silver scales had turned almost black, and they lay motionless on their thin blankets. The protein blocks remained stacked in neat piles, barely touched. Time was running out, and nobody seemed to understand what was slowly killing them. Dr. Haerin Lee walked through the medical bay's corridors, her tablet showing the morning's patient schedule. As the station's only human nutritionist, she saw refugees from dozens of different species every week. Most arrived malnourished and weak, but they usually improved quickly once they started eating proper food. Today felt different, though. Her first appointment was with a young Kithani female who could barely lift her head. Haerin had seen this individual just 5 days ago, and the change was shocking. The silver scales that had been dull before were now flaking off like old paint. Dark spots covered her arms, and her breathing sounded labored and painful. Haerin checked her medical scanner readings twice. The numbers made no sense. According to the device, this patient should be recovering. The protein blocks contained all necessary vitamins and minerals for most known species. Yet somehow the Kithani was getting worse instead of better. The next 3 Kithani patients showed identical symptoms. Their bodies were rejecting the standard food completely. Haerin had studied nutrition for 15 years, working with over 30 different alien species. She had never seen anything like this before. It was as if their digestive systems were designed for something completely different. The massive space station Nexus hung in the void like a metal city, its lights twinkling against the darkness. Ships came and went every day, but today something different approached. The Veltara limped through space, its hull scarred and broken, leaving a trail of debris behind it. The ship shook violently as it tried to dock, metal groaning under stress. During her lunch break, Haerin walked down to Cargo Bay 7. She wanted to see the living conditions for herself. The sight that greeted her made her stomach turn. Dozens of Kithani sat motionless in small groups, their once beautiful scales now grey and brittle. The youngest ones lay curled up against their parents, making no sounds at all. What struck her most was the silence. Refugee areas were usually noisy places, filled with conversation, crying children, and the sounds of daily life. Here, the quiet was almost complete. Only the occasional whisper or soft footstep broke the eerie stillness. It reminded her of a hospital ward where patients were too sick to speak. Hayrin noticed something else strange. Piles of protein blocks sat untouched near each family group. The Kithani had tried to eat them initially, but now they seemed unable to stomach even small bites. Several individuals looked desperately hungry, yet they pushed the food away when offered. That evening, Hayrin returned to her small quarters and pulled up everything she could find about Kithani biology. The station's database had limited information. Most records described them as peaceful farmers and artists from a distant star system. There were mentions of their unique digestive processes, but the details were frustratingly vague. She spent the next 3 nights reading scientific journals and medical reports. Her coffee grew cold as she studied alien biochemistry texts, searching for clues. The more she learned, the more worried she became. The Kithani digestive system was unlike anything she had encountered before. During her morning rounds, Hayrin watched as another young Kithani was brought to the medical bay on a stretcher. This one was barely conscious, his scales falling off in large patches. Dr. Yoon, the Valorian physician, shook his head sadly. Standard treatments were not working, and he was running out of options. Hayrin made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going home after her shift, she headed to the station's research library. If the medical database could not help her understand the Kithani, maybe the agricultural records could. These beings had been farmers for thousands of years. Their food production methods might hold the key to saving them. The library was empty, except for a few late-night researchers. Hayrin found a quiet corner and began searching through agricultural databases from across the galaxy. She looked for anything related to Kithani farming techniques, crop varieties, and food preparation methods. Most of the information was old and incomplete, but slowly a pattern began to emerge. The Kithani had not just grown regular crops. They had developed complex fermentation processes that transformed simple plants into something their bodies could actually digest. Without these specially prepared foods, they were essentially starving to death even with full stomachs. The laboratory's dim lights cast long shadows as Hayrin hunched over her research terminal at 2 in the morning. Empty coffee cups littered her desk, and her eyes burned from staring at screens for hours. She had been here every night for a week, trying to solve the puzzle that was slowly killing the Kithani refugees. Her breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Buried deep in an old agricultural report, she found detailed records of Kithani food production methods. Their ancestors had developed something called life chain fermentation over thousands of years. It was not just cooking. It was a complex biological process that transformed simple plants into something completely different. Hayrin leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. The pieces were finally starting to fit together. The Kithani digestive system had evolved alongside these fermented foods. Their stomachs produced different acids, their intestines had specialized bacteria, and their entire metabolic process depended on specific enzyme chains that only existed in properly prepared plant matter. She pulled up the chemical analysis of standard protein blocks on her second monitor. The comparison made her heart sink. Not only did the protein blocks lack the enzymes the Kithani needed, they actually contained compounds that were toxic to their unique digestive system. It was like feeding chocolate to a dog. What seemed nutritious to most species was slowly poisoning them. The laboratory door creaked open, startling her. Dr. Yoon entered, looking as exhausted as she felt. He had been working overtime trying to treat the Kithani patients, but nothing seemed to help. 3 more had collapsed that day, and the medical bay was running out of bed space. "Still here?" he asked, settling into a chair beside her workstation. His forearms moved restlessly, a sign of stress among his people. "I lost another one tonight, the youngest female. She just stopped breathing." Hayrin felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She turned her screen toward him. showing the research she had uncovered. "I think I know what's happening to them. Look at this." She pointed to a diagram showing Kithani digestive anatomy. "Their stomachs are not designed to break down our standard food. It's like asking a car engine to run on water instead of fuel." Dr. A. Yoon studied the information, his large eyes widening with understanding. "So the protein blocks are actually harming them." He ran one hand through his head tentacles, a gesture of disbelief. "We have been accidentally poisoning them for 2 weeks." The weight of this realization hit them both. Every meal they had provided was making the situation worse. The Kithani were not just starving, they were being slowly killed by the very food meant to save them. The medical scans showing organ stress now made perfect sense. Hayrin scrolled through more data, her fingers trembling slightly. According to this research, they need foods that have been fermented for at least 60 days using specific bacterial cultures. The enzymes produced during this process are essential for their survival. Without them, their organs start shutting down. She pulled up the latest medical reports from the refugee bay. The timeline was terrifying. Based on the rate of deterioration, she was seeing the remaining Kithani had maybe 3 or 4 days before their digestive systems failed completely. After that, even if they found the right food, it might be too late. Dr. Yoon stood up abruptly, pacing around the small laboratory. "But how can we get fermented Kithani food? Their homeworld is gone. There are no trade routes, no stored supplies. Even if we could somehow recreate their fermentation process, it takes months." Hayrin stared at her research notes, her mind racing. Somewhere in all this scientific data was the key to saving 43 lives. The enzyme chains the Kithani needed were incredibly complex, but maybe there was a way to synthesize them artificially. Her laboratory equipment was basic, but she had access to the station's food synthesizers and fermentation chambers. The clock on her wall showed 3:47 a.m. Time was running out, and she was the only person who understood what needed to be done. The other refugees would wake up in a few hours, weaker than the day before, not knowing that someone was finally working to save them. Hayrin's quarters had been transformed into a makeshift laboratory. Every available surface was covered with glass containers, heating elements, and bubbling mixtures. The smell of fermentation filled the small space, a sour, sweet odor that made her neighbors complain about strange cooking smells coming from her room. She had raided her personal food storage, using ingredients she had been saving for months. Rice from Earth, algae cultures from Proxima Station, and various plant extracts she kept for her research. None of these were Kithani foods, but they contained the basic building blocks she needed to work with. The fermentation chamber hummed quietly in the corner, its temperature carefully controlled. Inside, dozens of test samples bubbled and changed color, as beneficial bacteria worked to break down complex proteins. Hayrin checked on them every hour, taking notes and adjusting the conditions based on what she learned from the ancient Kithani agricultural records. Her first attempts were complete failures. The mixtures either spoiled quickly or produced compounds that were clearly toxic. She threw out batch after batch, growing more frustrated with each failure. Time was slipping away, and she could hear the concern in Dr. Yoon's voice during their daily updates about the Kithani patients. Dr. Jin Ho Seo visited her quarters on the second night, finding her hunched over a microscope at 3 in the morning. He was a practical man who believed in proven medical treatments, not experimental cooking projects. The sight of her cramped room filled with amateur chemistry equipment made him shake his head. "You are killing yourself over this," he said, moving aside a tray of failed experiments to sit down. "The Kithani situation is tragic, but you cannot save everyone. Sometimes we have to accept that some species are just not compatible with our environment." Hayrin looked up from her microscope, her eyes red with exhaustion. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the sample she was examining. "I am starting to see the enzyme chains form. It is working, just very slowly." The microscopic view showed tiny protein structures beginning to link together in complex patterns. Jin Ho examined the sample, but to him it looked like random bacterial growth. "Even if you create something that resembles Kithani food, how do you know it will not harm? Or them further, you could accidentally poison the remaining survivors." This thought had kept Hayrin awake for days. She was working without proper testing facilities or safety protocols. One mistake could kill the very beings she was trying to save, but doing nothing would definitely kill them, so she pushed forward with careful determination. On the third night, something changed. Batch number 47 smelled different from all the others. Instead of the harsh chemical odor of her previous attempts, this mixture had a rich, earthy smell that reminded her of fresh soil after rain. The bacterial cultures were thriving, producing exactly the types of enzymes she had been trying to create. She ran test after test on the sample, comparing its chemical composition to the data from Kithani agricultural records. The enzyme chains were not perfect matches, but they were remarkably close. Her improvised fermentation process had somehow recreated the basic digestive requirements that the Kithani needed to survive. The mixture looked unappetizing, a thick, brownish liquid with an unusual texture, but under the microscope, it was beautiful. Complex protein structures danced and merged, creating the life-giving compounds that had sustained the Kithani species for thousands of years. Hayrin sat back in her chair, staring at the container of liquid that might save 43 lives. Her hands shook slightly as she realized the magnitude of what she had accomplished. Using nothing but basic laboratory equipment and determination, she had essentially recreated an alien species' entire food production system. But now came the terrifying part. She would have to test her creation on beings who were already dying, knowing that one mistake could make their situation worse. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but she had come too far to give up now. The thermal container felt heavy in Hayrin's hands as she walked through the station corridors toward Cargo Bay 7. Inside the insulated vessel, her experimental mixture stayed warm at exactly the temperature her research suggested would be optimal. She had checked the container's seal 3 times, worried that the strange smell might leak out and attract unwanted attention. Her heart pounded as she approached the cargo bay entrance. Security guard Dong Min Cho gave her a curious look as she passed through the checkpoint. "Taking food to the refugees?" he asked, noting her medical badge and the container she carried. "That's kind of you, but they already get their rations." Hayrin nodded without explaining further. How could she tell him that those rations were slowly killing the very beings they were meant to help? The thermal container seemed to grow heavier. With each step, as the weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders, the cargo bay was quieter than usual. Many of the Kithani lay motionless on their thin blankets, too weak to move around. Their once silver scales had turned an alarming shade of black, and several individuals showed signs of severe dehydration. The sight made Hayrin's stomach clench with urgency. Thessara sat in the center of the refugee group, her back straight despite her obvious weakness. Even in her deteriorated state, she maintained the dignity of a leader. Her large eyes tracked Hayrin's approach with curiosity and hope. Few station personnel visited them anymore, except for the medical staff who came to remove those who had stopped breathing. "I brought something that might help," Hayrin said softly, kneeling beside the elderly Kithani. She opened the thermal container, releasing a cloud of aromatic steam. The smell was earthy and complex, unlike anything the refugees had encountered. Since leaving their homeworld, the other Kithani stirred at the unfamiliar scent. Several lifted their heads for the first time in days, their nostrils flaring as they tried to identify what they were smelling. A few younger ones actually sat up, drawn by an instinct they could not explain. Thessara's hands trembled as she accepted the container. Her fingers, once steady and strong, shook with the effort of holding the vessel. She looked at Hayrin with eyes that held both gratitude and fear. Too many disappointments had taught her to be cautious about hope. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible through the universal translator. The device struggled to convey the complex emotions in her words, desperation mixed with the faint possibility of salvation. "Food," Hayrin replied simply. "The kind your people need." She had prepared a longer explanation about enzyme chains and fermentation processes, but looking at Thessara's weakened state, she realized that simple words were better. The first taste was like a shock to Thessara's system. Her digestive tract, which had been shutting down for weeks, suddenly recognized something it could process. The familiar enzyme patterns triggered responses that had been dormant since leaving her homeworld. Her eyes widened in surprise and relief. Within minutes, Thessara's breathing became less labored. The tight knots in her stomach began to relax, as her body finally received nutrients it could actually use. Color started returning to her scales, a faint shimmer of silver appearing beneath the dull black surface. The other Kithani watched in amazement as their leader's condition visibly improved. Word spread quickly through their small community in soft whispers and gentle touches. For the first time in weeks, they dared to believe that survival might be possible. Hayrin divided the remaining mixture into smaller portions, making sure each family group received some. The container had seemed large when she prepared it, but now she worried there was not enough for everyone. She made mental notes about increasing the next batch size and improving the fermentation process. As she watched the Kithani consume her improvised food substitute, Hayrin felt a mixture of pride and terror. Her experiment was working, but she had no idea what the long-term effects might be. She was essentially conducting medical trials on a dying species, using nothing but hope and determination as her guide. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Hayrin had returned to her quarters to prepare another batch when she received an urgent message from Dr. Yoon. "You need to come to Cargo Bay 7 immediately," his voice crackled through her communicator. "Something extraordinary is happening." She rushed through the station corridors, her mind racing with possibilities. Had her experimental food caused some terrible reaction? Were the Kithani getting worse? The security checkpoint seemed to take forever as she fumbled with her identification badge, her hands shaking with nervous energy. The scene that greeted her in Cargo Bay 7 was nothing like what she had left hours earlier. The oppressive silence had been replaced by soft sounds of conversation and movement. Several Kithani were sitting up for the first time in weeks, their backs straight and their heads held high with renewed dignity. Most remarkable was the change in their appearance. The dull black scales that had been flaking off like old paint were now showing hints of their original silver color. It was as if someone had polished tarnished metal, revealing the beauty that had been hidden underneath layers of sickness and despair. Young Kithani, who had been silent for days, were making soft chirping sounds, a musical communication that filled the cargo bay with gentle melodies. Their parents responded with their own chirps, creating conversations that sounded like wind chimes dancing in a gentle breeze. The sound brought tears to Hayrin's eyes. It was the sound of hope returning to a dying people. Thessara stood near the center of the group, and the change in her was remarkable. Her posture had straightened, her eyes were bright and alert, and her scales gleamed with returning health. She was surrounded by other Kithani, who were eager to share their own recovery stories through soft touches and gentle sounds. When Thessara saw Hayrin approaching, something unexpected happened. The proud leader of an ancient species began to weep. Tears flowed down her scaled cheeks as she struggled to find words that could express what she was feeling. The universal translator buzzed and clicked, working to convert emotions that had no direct equivalent in galactic common language. "Why?" was the first word that came through clearly. Thessara's voice was stronger now, but filled with wonder and confusion. "Why would you do this for us? We have nothing to give you, no payment, no trade goods, no services. We are refugees with empty hands." Hayrin felt her own eyes filling with tears as she looked around at the recovering Kithani. Children were playing quietly in corners, their scales brightening with each passing hour. Adults were standing and walking around, testing their renewed strength. The change was happening so quickly it seemed almost miraculous. "You do not need to give me anything," Hayrin replied softly. "You were suffering, and I could help. That is enough reason." Her words seemed to puzzle Thessara, who tilted her head in confusion. The elderly Kithani explained something that made Hayrin's heart ache. In their 1,000-year history of space travel and trade with other species, no one had ever helped them without expecting something in return. Every act of kindness had come with a price: labor contracts, mining rights, or technology transfers. The idea of someone helping purely out of compassion was completely foreign to their experience. Other species had viewed the Kithani as useful for their agricultural knowledge or as cheap workers for dangerous jobs. When they lost their homeworld and had nothing left to offer, those same species had turned away from them. Only humans had shown genuine concern for their welfare without calculating what they might gain from the relationship. Dr. Yoon arrived with his medical scanner, documenting the remarkable recovery. The readings showed organ function returning to normal, digestive systems processing nutrients properly, and overall health improving at an unprecedented rate. He shook his head in amazement, having never seen anything like it in his medical career. Word began to spread throughout Nexus Station about the miracle in Cargo Bay 7. Other station personnel came to witness the recovery, drawn by curiosity and disbelief. The Kithani, who had been written off as a lost cause, were now walking around, talking, and even laughing together. 3 days after the miraculous recovery, Thessara approached Hyrin with a serious expression that seemed different from her usual grateful demeanor. The cargo bay had transformed into a bustling community where healthy Kithani were organizing their belongings and caring for the few who were still recovering. The change was remarkable, but Thessara seemed burdened by something weighing heavily on her mind. "There is something I must tell you," Thessara said quietly, gesturing for Hyrin to follow her to a secluded corner of the cargo bay. Her scales had regained their full silver luster, and her movements were strong and purposeful again. "My people have not been entirely truthful about who we are." Hyrin settled beside the elderly Kithani, curious about what could be so important, that it required such secrecy. She had assumed the Kithani were refugees fleeing a natural disaster, seeking only shelter and basic survival. Their quiet dignity and artistic nature had impressed everyone who met them. "We told the station administrators that we were farmers and artists," Thessara continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. This was not exactly a lie, but it was not the complete truth either. We have hidden our real capabilities for generations, and with good reason. The universal translator struggled with some of Thessara's words, suggesting she was using technical terms that had no direct equivalent in galactic common. Hyrin leaned closer, sensing that she was about to learn something extraordinary about these remarkable people. Thessara reached into her worn travel pouch and withdrew a small, unremarkable seed. To most observers, it would have looked like any ordinary plant seed, the kind that farmers throughout the galaxy used for basic crop production. But as she held it up to the light, Hyrin could see that it had an unusual crystalline structure. "This seed will grow in any environment," Thessara explained. "Desert worlds with no water, frozen planets where nothing should survive, even in the toxic atmospheres of mining colonies. My people did not just farm ordinary crops, we created plants that could transform impossible worlds into gardens." The implications of this revelation hit Hyrin like a physical blow. Terraforming technology was the most valuable commodity in the galaxy. Corporations spent billions trying to develop ways to make hostile planets habitable. Wars had been fought over access to worlds that could potentially support life. And here was an entire species that possessed the knowledge to turn any planet into a paradise. "We are genetic engineers," Thessara continued, "but not in the way most species understand the term. We do not use machines or computers. We work with living systems, guiding evolution and adaptation through processes that take decades to perfect. Every plant we create is a work of art that can sustain life where none existed before." Hyrin understood now why the Kithani had hidden their true nature. Species with this kind of knowledge would never be allowed to live freely. They would be enslaved by corporations, controlled by governments, or fought over by competing factions. Their peaceful existence as simple farmers had been a carefully maintained disguise. "Who are you telling me this?" Hyrin asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The trust implied in this revelation was overwhelming. Thessara was sharing secrets that could reshape the galactic economy and political landscape. "Because you saved us without expecting anything in return," Thessara replied, her eyes shining with emotion. "In our 1,000 years of contact with other species, no one has ever shown such pure compassion. Every transaction, every relationship, every act of kindness has come with conditions and expectations. except yours. She went on to explain how other species had approached the Kithani over the centuries. The Valorians had offered medical technology in exchange for agricultural knowledge. The Centaurians had proposed military protection for terraforming. Secrets. Even peaceful trader species had always calculated what they could gain from any relationship. But Hairin had risked her career, spent her personal resources, and worked sleepless nights to save beings she had never met before. She had asked for nothing in return, expected no payment, and sought no advantage from her actions. This kind of selfless behavior was so rare that it challenged everything the Kithani thought they knew about galactic civilization. "Humans are different," Thessara said with wonder in her voice. "Your species possesses something we thought had been lost from the galaxy long ago, the ability to care for strangers simply because they are suffering. This is why I am sharing our secret with you, and why my people have decided to offer our knowledge exclusively to humanity." The story of Dr. Hairin Lee and the Kithani refugees spread through the galaxy faster than anyone could have imagined. It started with whispered conversations in Nexus Station's corridors, but within weeks, every major trade route buzzed with tales of the human who had saved an entire species using nothing but kitchen equipment and determination. Station Administrator. Junwoo Park found his quiet administrative job transformed overnight into something resembling interstellar diplomacy. His communication system, which usually handled routine supply requests and docking permits, now chimed constantly with incoming messages from across the galaxy. Representatives from dozens of species wanted to know more about this remarkable human achievement. The Valorian Medical Council sent an official inquiry, asking for detailed reports about Hairin's methods. They offered substantial payments for access to her research, suggesting that human nutritional science might be more advanced than they had previously understood. Their four-armed physicians were particularly interested in how she had solved a problem that had stumped their best medical experts. Trade Federation representatives arrived on expensive ships, carrying briefcases full of contracts and proposals. They wanted to hire human nutritionists for their refugee processing centers, offering salaries that would have made Hairin wealthy beyond imagination. Corporate executives saw profit potential in human compassion, imagining ways to monetize empathy for galactic markets. But the most shocking development came when the Kithani made their announcement. In a formal ceremony broadcast throughout the galaxy, Thessara stood before representatives from every major species and declared their people's intention to share their terraforming secrets exclusively with humanity. The reaction was immediate and intense. The Centaurian Empire, which had spent centuries trying to acquire terraforming technology, offered the Kithani an entire star system in exchange for their knowledge. Mining corporations promised wealth beyond measure. Even peaceful research institutions begged for access to just a small portion of their genetic engineering capabilities. Thessara refused them all with quiet dignity. "Humans showed us kindness when we had nothing to offer in return," she explained through the universal translator. "They helped us not because they wanted something from us, but because they saw suffering and chose to act. This is the kind of partner we want for our people's future." The galactic community struggled to understand this decision. Political analysts on news networks debated the economic implications of the Kithani choice. Military strategists worried about the shift in power that would come from human access to terraforming technology. Corporate boards held emergency meetings to discuss how this development might affect their expansion plans. Meanwhile, human colonies throughout the galaxy found themselves suddenly popular destinations for diplomatic missions. Species that had barely acknowledged humanity's existence now sent ambassadors with gifts and proposals for cooperation. Research universities offered exchange programs, trading companies proposed exclusive partnerships, and even military alliances extended invitations for humans to join their ranks. Dr. Hairin Lee became the most famous human in galactic history, though she continued working her regular shifts in the medical bay as if nothing had changed. Reporters from across the galaxy requested interviews, but she consistently declined, saying her work with the refugees was not finished. Her humble response to fame only enhanced humanity's growing reputation for integrity and selflessness. The transformation in humanity's galactic status was remarkable. Before the Kithani incident, humans were considered a minor species with limited technology and no particular influence. Their colonies were small, their trade relationships were modest, and their voice in galactic affairs was barely heard above the noise of more established civilizations. Now, suddenly, human settlements became centers of activity and interest. The Kithani began working with human agricultural scientists to develop crops that could grow on previously uninhabitable worlds. Desert planets bloomed with engineered plants that thrived in extreme conditions. Frozen moons sprouted forests that generated their own heat. Even the toxic atmosphere of former mining worlds was gradually cleaned by specially designed organisms. The success of these terraforming projects attracted more attention to human-Kithani partnerships. Other species watched in amazement as barren worlds transformed into garden paradises within months instead of centuries. The economic value of this technology was beyond calculation, but the Kithani continued to refuse all offers from non-human civilizations. Human diplomats who had once struggled to get meetings with major galactic powers now found their schedules packed with requests for cooperation. The galaxy had learned an important lesson about the power of genuine compassion, and everyone wanted to be associated with the species that had demonstrated such remarkable character in their darkest hour.